Okay, over to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Don, for all you do to keep us straight and narrow here. So I just wanted to bid everybody good evening, and thank you for the turnout. It's really impressive. Welcome to all for joining us tonight for this Immanuel Anglican Church Regina Indigenous Service sponsored Learning and Awareness event. This will be the first of a series of learning events that we'll be proposing over the next year and a half or so, all in the name of truth and reconciliation, to get to know more of our family members in the community. This is our commitment, Immanuel Anglican Church's commitment to the truth and reconciliation calls to action. And we do appreciate and acknowledge the response that we're getting for this session, and we thank everybody for taking the time from their busy schedules to participate in such an event. I want to start off with a couple of housekeeping matters. One of them, of course, is having an opening prayer for our session. So if you bear with me, I'll do a quick opening prayer. Creator, we thank you that you get to glorify your name in our lives. We thank you for bringing us together here for this gathering to know a little bit more about each other in this week of prayers for unity. We want to learn more from each other, from our brothers and sisters. I pray that we come together in unity and support to help each other when we fall, to encourage each other when we succeed, and we work together to produce results. Creator, we ask you to unite us in a community of justice, free of racism, full of love and peace with one another. We ask this in your name. Amen. The other thing I wanted to do was acknowledge that we are on treaty territory, the original and traditional lands of the Niewak, Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, and the Métis Nations. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. This evening, we are very fortunate and honored to have with us tonight as our presenter, Elder Senator Saul Sanderson, truly a good friend of mine for many, many years. I don't want to tell you how many years, but we've been very good friends. We've been working together in a number of files. So I'm very pleased that he's got the time to devote some time to us tonight. Senator Saul Sanderson has become one of the most well-known and respected Indigenous leaders in our community, provincially, nationally, and internationally. He has been a very active and committed to asserting the treaty rights of our people. He was chief at one point with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations here in Saskatchewan, and he's been chief at his local reserve. He was later elected as a senator of the FSIN and has served in that capacity ever since. So we are truly honored to turn over the presentation for tonight to Elder Senator Saul Sanderson. And Don will keep us on track on something that you would need some help with here, Saul.
Yeah. So Senator Sanderson, if you could just let me know what document you want to be on the screen, I've got them queued up and ready to go. So I can help you out with that.
How's that?
There you go.
Got it? Okay. Put the inherent rights chart on. And thank you for the invitation. And I wish you all the best in 2022. I first started in our Indian politics when I was 15 years old. And I just turned 80 here in October. So it's been a long road, but it's been a very constructive one. And people don't know much about that whole system that we're going to discuss tonight. And I call it a code of silence, because as we move along, you'll see much of what I'm talking about has not been understood. It hasn't been discussed or debated. And most people don't know anything about it. But it's the basis of the foundation of our history. And what I'm going to do is take you through what inherent rights are. And following that, I'm going to highlight 500 years of colonial policy. And you'll see what that is all about. Both the Empire colonial policies and the Canadian colonial policies. And while we're on the inherent rights, we'll also discuss the treaties. And when we finish up with the colonial policies, I want to take you to the broader picture of what governs us and how. But also, it's important that we understand that the foundation for Crown Indian Nations relations is based on inherent rights. And nowhere in Canadian policies or law has inherent rights been recognized up until Judy Wilson, the Minister of Justice, came to office. And she built in the 10 principles based on inherent rights. And then she developed 22 justice directives that identifies the foundation of Crown Indian Nations relations based on inherent rights. Now, keep in mind, nobody has dealt with those politically, lawfully, here in Canada, and you'll see why as I move along. So when we look at inherent rights that we have as Indian people, there's so many terms that just try to describe who we are. And the treaties and the framework that we're talking about, a comprehensive legal political framework that I'll end up with, recognizes Indian nations and the Crown. Now, when I'm talking about the inherent rights, Judge Lammer, the Supreme Court judge years ago, said, all your rights supersede everything. I got 2 questions, he said. What are they and where do they come from? He never got an answer. But the late Judge Dixon, and I worked with him on the patriation of the Constitution. And he was clearly interested in dealing with the same issues. And he had the same question. What are inherent rights and where do they come from? And many of our own people, our own Indian people, ask the same question. And when we look at that whole process of the source of inherent rights, they're granted to our Indian nations and Indian peoples by the Creator. They come from no other source. And they existed for centuries. And they exist today. So when I talk about the inherent rights, you can categorize them in terms of the political rights, in terms of our inherent sovereignty, our inherent jurisdiction, and our inherent legal system. And when we look at that, it also deals with the national powers of governing, internal, external, international. And when we talk about the treaty making process, the inherent sovereignty provides for the recognition of our national powers of treaty making. These days, you hear a lot of talk about treaty relations, treaty relations, treaty relations, but nobody goes into depth on what they are. So when we look at this whole process of inherent rights in terms of the political rights, that's basically what they are. And they're very key to what has to be done today. The other one, of course, are your social rights, your language, your spiritual, cultural, education, inherent rights to our health system, our justice, and our economy, our economics, inherent rights to lands and resources. And when we look at the issue of economic rights, that includes air. As a young leader, I used to talk about the jurisdiction for airspace. And my own people would say, Saul, that's pie in the sky. Well, nobody's looking at it as pie in the sky now when you look at the climate change that's happening and the environment. So that has to be addressed fully. It includes your lands, your waters, includes the housing, and it includes fishing, trapping, hunting, gathering, and of course, like I said, it includes the health, education, and social services. Spiritual, cultural rights, ceremony and prayers, and when we look at the form of worship, when we talk about the form of worship, some religion uses incense. We use smudges. They come from different sources of sweetgrass, those different types of plants, and they're there for the same purpose. Now, when we look at the process of implementing the societies that we had and the lodges, we had highly structured and disciplined societies. And those societies were in support of the kinship clan system. And the democratic system that non-Indians learned about came from studying our functions of our clan system, of our nations. Even the US, when they developed their constitution, they examined the structure and the forms of government that we were implementing. And they found it was very democratic. And along with the clan system, we had the highly structured and disciplined societies, like I said, in every sector. Now, the nice thing about those societies is they cross the boundaries of all our nations. Take, for example, the Medicine Society. They policed themselves. They dealt with the whole field of health and medication. And we had neutral grounds across North America and the US where they met to exchange information and knowledge on healing and prevention, but how to use the protocol respecting the gathering of the medicines and how you treated the process, spiritual process in using the medicines that were gathered for healing and protection and protection. So when you look at all those inherent rights that I just talked about, and the inherent rights includes justice, and we have had a process, like I said, was a democratic process. We had an actual legislative branch, an executive branch, judicial branch, and we had systems of operations by sector. And most people know nothing about that. In spite of all that is existed then and still exists today, Canada had a law in the Indian Act right up to 1956 that it made it illegal for our people to assemble, even on the reserves. We couldn't assemble. And of course, as you know, in the process, they outlawed our government, our jurisdiction, and our laws. I'll talk about that a little more as we get into those colonial policies and how they dealt with that in their process. And when we look at this whole field now of inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, as you can see now, we have inherent rights in every sector. The inherent right to education, the inherent right to justice, the inherent rights to health, inherent rights to lands and resources, the inherent rights to citizenship and membership. There's inherent rights applies in every sector. And we have duties and responsibilities that are associated with those inherent rights. And again, the code of silence was such that the teachings of those responsibilities and duties was very limited because of the policies, the colonial policies. But today, we can organize and move ahead with formal implementation and giving them legal effect under our government jurisdiction and laws. You heard a lot of the debate about the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Well, there's also the Declaration of the Organization of American States, and Canada belongs to that organization. And that's North, South, Central America. And they have a similar declaration, but a little more info on how to deal with the treaties under that declaration. Now, it's important that you know what these instruments are all about. And as we move along, you'll see how important they are when it comes to governing the Crown Indian Nations relations, the Crown Inuit relations, the Crown Métis relations. And those are very critical forms of recognition that we have today compared to just a few years ago. So our task of our governments and our people, how do we implement UNDRIP? If we say we are sovereign, then we better be doing something with how we implement it. But at the same time, the national powers of treaty making, the national powers of governing require that we implement all our inherent rights and title. And when I say that, what form of recognition do we provide and how? Well, I just listed majority of those inherent rights that we have collectively as peoples of our nations. And the elders will tell you our collective rights that we recognize for implementation enforces individual rights. Canadian law only recognizes individual rights, does not go to the stage and the phase of how you implement collective rights. Now, we have all those inherent rights that we've identified, and that's what Judge Lammer was asking about. But we have failed because of the colonial policies to identify them, to define them. And today we can move ahead with that strategy on how we define every one of those inherent rights and title under our own language. And how do we do that? We do it based on our traditions, customs, practices, beliefs, and values. And every nation has to do that. And these inherent rights and title, inherent sovereignty that I talk about impacts every nation in North America and Indigenous peoples worldwide. And you'll see what that's all about when I come to it. But when we have them identified, we define them. Now, where are the duties and responsibilities that we're supposed to be implementing collectively for every one of those inherent rights? And that's a major task for our people today, and the governments of our people, and the institutions of our governments, and how we then move ahead to implement specific plans and strategies in every sector, implementing inherent rights and title and sovereignty. And when we do that, what form of unique and special laws do we construct and enact to implement and enforce all our inherent rights? So when you look at the inherent right of sovereignty, that provides for the recognition of our nations, the sovereignty of our nations. But more than that, it recognizes the inherent self-determination powers of, and rights to govern. And that's where I said the national powers of governing are recognized in the form of how we implement our internal, external, and international affairs. And when we do that, then we also have the national powers of treaty making. So when we come to the whole area of the process of implementing the relationship of inherent rights and title, inherent sovereignty, and the treaties, how do they link? How do they come together? Well, through the national powers of treaty making, we made treaties amongst our nations for many generations before we met any non-Indians. And people say that our people didn't know much about making the treaties that were made with the Crown and right of Ireland and England. Well, those treaties are very powerful. And how did we make them? Well, we didn't put all these inherent rights on the table. We didn't put our inherent sovereignty of our nations on the table. We didn't put our powers of governing on the table. And when we look at how we dealt with the whole field of rights that I just spoke to, they're reserved by treaty making, they're recognized by treaty making, they're confirmed by treaty making, and they're guaranteed by treaty making. See, the English law and governing systems assume that these types of rights that we just went through were terminated when we made the treaties with the Crown. Well, we wouldn't have been sitting at the table if we were terminating ourselves. So that was how we exercised the national powers of treaty making. So in Treaty 6, through the whole Wilton Littlechild and others, we took the treaty number 6 to the UN to identify the status of the treaty. And what they did in reviewing the status of Treaty 6, they said it's an international treaty. So what that does, it makes treaties 1 to 11 international treaties. And when they looked at the process, they said, we want to examine what the Crown and the British Parliament did to breach Treaty 6. So they looked at the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement of 1930. And they said, this is illegal. There was international treaties made with the Indian nations, and they were not present when the British Parliament passed the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. But the other issue that's not dealt with is that's not just a law. That's a constitutional amendment to the BNA Act. And there's much more needed than just the English Parliament determining the status of the Constitution in 1930. There was authorities here in Canada, along with our own governing authorities, that had the powers to determine the status of that act. So that's unfinished business respecting the patriation of the process that they engaged in transferring treaty responsibilities from the Crown and Right of England and Ireland to the Crown and Right of Canada. And when I met with the law lords in England, I said, where is your law that provided for the lawful transfer of the treaties from the Crown and Right of England and Ireland to the Crown and Right of Canada? And the chair of the law lords said, there is no law, but there's a tradition and a practice of what we did and how. And he said, the term is called Novation of the Crown. That's what it is. And that's what the authority is that we use to transfer the treaties in Canada from the Crown and Right of England and Ireland to the Crown and Right of Canada. That type of business, treaty business, is still unfinished treaty business. When you talk about moving the international treaties from one nation to another nation. And we need to go there. And I'll show you how we have to go there. Now, when we look at the inherent rights treaties, we now have treaty rights as well. So most people in dealing with the treaties then, and the issues impacting on us, don't deal with this whole background that I just gave you. And it's not just historical, it's current. So it's critical that people get to know what they're all about. And the churches were engaged in the colonial policy implementation of the empires, and after the empires dissolved themselves and set up governments of other nations like Canada. And I'll show you how that happened. So we now have the inherent right and treaty right to education. And the inherent right to education, we can scope out all the skills impacting on science, impacting on the environment, impacting a whole range of principles that are put in place for university education and colleges. So the inherent right and treaty right to education includes schools from kindergarten to grade 12. It includes schools, institutions, post-secondary institutions. For what? For trades, for skills, and professional education and development. I, as a chief in 1972, went home and was elected chief. And we went to an integrated school for 15 years. And we graduated one partial grade 12 student in 15 years. The parents, the grandparents, and everybody said, enough is enough. We're going to take control. So I got direction from the people in our assemblies, and we went ahead and implemented our own Indian control education system, not just a school. So when we set up our Indian control school at home and our Indian control education system, we also offered the degree program in teacher ed social work. And a mother and daughter graduated with their degree in social work at the same time. And we've done much more in terms of how we implemented the education system. When we were in the Kinistino, we had students at grade 9, 10, 11, and 12 with reading skills of grade of 5 and 4 and 5, with math skills at 4 and 5, and so on. Now, first thing we done, we introduced an education program that would teach the skills and brought in instructors that would teach skills. But we also introduced our own education curriculum. And it included all of what I just talked about in terms of our status and our rights. And we didn't only talk about inherent sovereignty, that we want to set up our own governing system as well, including taking control of lands and resources in the treaty territory, not just on the reserve by ban. And that's what needs to be discussed openly and publicly, is how do we implement those powers of governing, those national powers of governing? And that includes internationally. Now, in the treaty making process, many people don't realize that the making of treaties 1 to 11 is one major treaty between the Crown and Indian nations. And you take all the provisions and conditions from all the treaties 1 to 11. That's a mighty, mighty, powerful treaty. So one of the conditions that the UN said, if you have an international treaty, it'll only maintain the status of international treaty if both parties give them legal effect under their government jurisdiction laws. Well, here it is 2022. Neither party has given them legal effect under their government jurisdiction laws. And I'm talking about the governments of Indian nations, and I'm talking about the government of Canada. So there's a need for unique and special laws, a schedule of unique and special laws that the governments of Indian nations have to enact and construct and implement, so that we're implementing formally under our government jurisdictional laws all the inherent rights and title, all the inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector. Likewise for Canada. And I'll go into part of the comprehensive framework. I was there from start to end, start to finish, when we dealt with the patronage of the Constitution. And some of you will remember the debate and discussion that happened on Section 35, 1 and 2 of the Constitution Act of 1982. I played a major role in dealing with that issue. And today, most people don't know what Section 35 is and how to implement it. So when you examine the authority and mandate under Section 35 now, Section 35 now takes over the authority of the federal government having responsibility for Indians and Indian land under Section 24.1. And the process there is now taken over under Section 35, but it expands the federal jurisdiction in a major way. The other thing that's not understood and recognized is that Section 92 powers under the BNA Act for the provincial government now become federal powers respecting the Crown Indian Nation relation. So the feds can formally now move ahead with implementing their laws, unique and special laws, recognizing inherent rights, treaties, and treaty rights in every sector, that lays out their legal, fiscal, jurisdictional trust obligations formally under their government, under the federal government, and their institutions. Now, I'll go back to where I was in terms of the inherent rights and treaties and treaty rights. I think a lot of what I just gave you is, again, what I call the code of silence. And when we hear people talk about treaties, they don't go into this whole background of information that I just gave you. The elders said you have to implement the spirit and intent of treaty. What were they talking about? Well, like I said, it's not the first time we made a treaty. So they were talking about how we reserve and recognize and confirm and guarantee all of our inherent rights and our sovereignty and our government. And on top of that, then, is added what we negotiated for the form of what you now call treaty rights. And again, that's what the spirit and intent of treaty is all about. But a lot of what we talk about in terms of process, then, it's much different from the non-Indian system. The non-Indian system likes to exclude the spiritual authority when they talk about their government. For us, the spiritual authority is a foundation in everything we do. In terms of the sovereignty of our nation, national powers of governing. And when we made the treaties, that was a very spiritual process. And there was a different language, like in most countries in their languages, they have a high language in dealing with their major political agenda. Well, likewise, we had a high language of dealing with treaty making and our inherent rights and our sovereignty. And they had the everyday language in terms of using our language, as what happens today in the process. Now, when we talk about those treaties, then we have the J Treaty that provides for our free border crossing and our international travel. And the UN has validated the J Treaty, and so has England. Now you see, getting back to that novation of the Crown theory, they didn't even deal with the J Treaty because Canada refused to. Well, Canada forgot that our international treaties are also there to deal with international affairs. So when you look at the status of our rights and our benefits, you must realize that our inherent sovereignty, our inherent rights, our treaties, and our treaty rights are portable. So our special rights and status don't end because we walk off the edge of the reserve. They don't end because you're registered under the Indian Act. And today, there's two categories of Indians now being registered as a result of Bill C-31. One category, you're registered an Indian with full benefits and rights. The other category, you're registered as an Indian with no benefits or rights. So we warned, the late David Henneke and I were sitting at the AFN table when Trudeau brought it to the constitutional table to see who supported the bill. And we sat in our chair, we didn't vote for it, everybody else stood up. And it was done. Nobody asked us why. Well, we saw how that bill would terminate whole families, not just one Indian at a time. And that's what's happening today. And that's why it's critical that we have our own citizenship acts and codes registering and certifying our own people. And in our own acts, Citizenship Act, we'd also include all these rights and benefits that I've talked about. And we'd include the portability of our status and our rights. And there's many other things that we include. Today, they're talking about child welfare and the benefits of the child and the rights of the child. And they wanted to try to put those things in the Child Welfare Act federally or under First Nations. Well, if you're going to guarantee the rights properly, they have to be certified and registered formally in the drafting of our own Citizenship Act and membership codes. So when we move along, then I'll give you some other examples as we go. Because when Trudeau set up the law review, they had 4 secretariats: a law review in Privy Council, a law review in Justice, a law review in Indian Affairs back then, and a law review in Finance. Those are secretariats, law review secretariats. And they called me one day, they said, "We need to talk to you." And we want to do a Zoom call for about 3 hours. You always use the term special rights, unique and special rights. They said, "We want to know some of those rights that have to be implemented with unique and special rights." I said, okay, let's take one example that's very sensitive to you and me. And I said, you call it taxation. Now there's 2 major issues that impact on the taxation issue. And I want to know from each of you, do you know about anything about tax immunity? Not one knew anything about tax immunity. I said, now you all know what tax exemption is. Well, why we have tax immunity from federal, provincial tax or municipal tax is because we have tax immunity that's based on the recognition of our sovereignty and the recognition of our international treaties. That's what provides us tax immunity. But we can still have our own tax regime under our own jurisdictional law. And when we look at the process of tax exemption, the provisions of treaties and inherent rights provides for goods and services to be provided by the Crown. And that's what we talk about in terms of the legal, fiscal, jurisdictional trust obligation of the Crown, respecting inherent rights, treaties, and rights having to be implemented. But the treaties also provide for socioeconomic benefits, and that's another form of tax exemption. So they said, several of them said, our colleagues have to hear this. Now you see, all that I just told you about is confirmed and recognized by the comprehensive legal political framework that I'll be highlighting for you. I said, okay, let's take another sensitive issue. You want to do it with the Indian Act? That says that you're going to be doing away with having to register Indians under your jurisdictional laws. So how are you going to do that? And they said, how do we do it? Well, I said, for your information, you've done something else. Right away, several of them said, now what did we do? I said, well, in the Constitution Act, Section 35(2) recognizes Indian, Métis, and Inuit. What form of recognition is that? That's a constitutional recognition. It's not a membership recognition like the Indian Act membership. That's a constitutional recognition of citizenship. So I told you, Saul Sanderson is a Cree. And he's a Cree of the Taxation band of the Cree Nation. So Saul Sanderson will be registered and certified under the Taxation Cree Citizenship Act. And that's how I'll do it. And our people will have to do it collectively. We need they all need their own citizenship act. When we looked at that process, then they said, what do you want us to do? I said, well, it's simple. You have a Citizenship Act of Canada. You have to add another part to the Citizenship Act of Canada that recognizes Saul Sanderson's status and Saul Sanderson's rights and the jurisdiction of our nations to control and register citizenship and certify citizenship. But you still need to have a head count registered under the Citizenship Act of Canada. And that'll include citizenship status and dual citizenship status. So what Section 35(2) of the Constitution Act of Canada does for Saul Sanderson's citizenship status, it provides him dual citizenship status as a Canadian. Because they would already have full citizenship status under our own Cree Citizenship Act. Now I could go on and on with examples for you like that, but that gives you two key examples of the kind of changes that are required in the English common law system and now in our own inherent legal system. And of course, we know Quebec has a civil code, which is French law. So the interface of jurisdictional law has been at play here in Canada for years. But you walk across the border, you'll have the recognition of the equality of government, jurisdictional law and courts, tribal government, state government, and federal government. So that's where we're heading here, whether people realize it or not. So I'll stop there in terms of the inherent rights and treaties and treaty rights after I'm done with this point. The inherent title to lands and resources. Under the treaty making process, in Treaty 6, we reserved a whole category of lands and resources and water and air. And when I talk about how they're reserved by Treaty 6, it says 640 acres per family of 5 or part thereof for an agricultural, reserve, or farmland. And it goes on to say, having due respect for lands presently cultivated. So my band, even though we lost our status and band right after making Treaty 6, before we entered into Treaty 6, we were engaged in the agricultural sector 6 to 7 generations before we made Treaty 6. We were in the trade, agricultural trade, and we took advantage of the north-south Saskatchewan River, and the advantage we had is that we lived close to the forks, and we provided the trading posts with goods and furs. The city of Prince Albert, when it started out, provided for goods and services from our Chigasté patient people and community. The Métis across the river on the west side also waited for support from us. And the church groups that were around also got their goods and services from us. We had the only threshing machine. So all the settlers that came and got into farming had to rely on us doing their harvesting for them. Now you see, we had all that and we lost all that. And I'm not going to go into much detail other than to say I worked with a team to reconstruct all the major fraud committed by James A. Smart and his partner, both senior officials in the federal government. They committed theft of Indian lands from 1896 to 1923. And I headed up the investigation on that and reconstructed all that fraud. Now, people don't hear anything about that stuff either, but it still has its impact on many of our communities and our people today. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through the 500 years of colonial policies. So you should be ready to stay till midnight. No, that whole colonial policy is critical. It's critical you understand what it is. Now again, this is what I call the code of silence. So when the empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal divided up the world, with the English Empire having North America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of India. Africa was controlled by France and I always forget the other nation, but Spain had South Central America. And when we look at that process of discovering the theory of the doctrine of discovery, once they were all done that, they realized that they had to deal with the issue of them stealing our lands and our resources. So what did they do to fix it in their own minds? They went to the Pope, and the Pope in 1493 issued a papal bull. What was that papal bull that the Pope issued in the form of Christian instructions? It says, Indigenous peoples are not human or Christian, because Indigenous people are not human. They don't have title to land and resources. Because Indigenous people are not human, they do not have rights. Now you see, when you look at that process, that was implemented worldwide by these empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal. It was France and Portugal that had Africa. And when you look at that process, they had another law that is part of the code of silence. Like, if I was to ask you, sitting in person, how many of you know about the law of dominance? And most places I go, nobody knows about that at all. What is the law of dominance? The law of dominance made it legal to kill the Indigenous peoples. That's what the law of dominance is. So the millions of Indigenous people slaughtered by the explorers was validated by that Christian law called the law of dominance. So when you look at these objectives and these policies that were issued by the Pope in 1493, here it is 2022, and we're still dealing with the same issues. Now, the Catholics, whenever I go to speak publicly, after I speak about these colonial policies and the papal bull, they say, how many of you here are Catholic? One place I went, the whole arena was full of people on the floor, ice, where the ice is made, and the bleachers, and just a few hands went up. When I went to sit down, an elderly lady come up, she said, I'm going to take over for a little while, she said. I'm going to show you something, she said. And she went up to the mic and she said, now Saul asked you a question, a very simple question. How many of you are Catholic? 85% of the people there were Catholic. And I said, well, they know what they have to do. And when I tell them, the Pope has to rescind and terminate that 1493 papal bull. And just the other day, and even before that, I got a call from Catholics. They say, what do we do about the apology? What should we do? And I said to the lady on the phone, I said, an apology does nothing. What that Pope has to do is formally withdraw and terminate that 1493 papal bull that they issued, impacting on us then and now. And to replace that papal bull that they issued back in 1493, we enter into a new reconciliation agreement that recognizes everything that I just talked about and what I'm going to say. In terms of our sovereignty being recognized, our national powers of treaty making, the treaty making process, the treaties, the inherent rights and treaties, and our relationships. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Because again, that's another code of silence. But for you, I grew up being an Anglican. And as a leader, I took one of the lead roles in shutting down the residential schools. And I was there in residential school in here in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. And I was already in the politics of things, of course. So I headed up the team here to either take over or close the residential school. And you all know why now. It's knowledge that everybody has today. And when we look at that whole process of dealing with those types of issues in that school, when I'm done with these colonial policies, you'll see the residential school was only one method of terminating Indians and Indian status. And when we move along then and look at the law of dominance, which made it legal to kill Indigenous peoples. I was on a police force as well for 5.5 years. And back then I already saw Indigenous, Native, Indian, Métis women going missing in Saskatchewan. And the numbers they have now for how many we lost is very low. It was already back then, and I'm talking 45 years ago, we were up to 4,000 female people missing. And that's another method that's been used, and it's still being used to terminate our people. So when you look at the process of moving forward, the papal bull was issued under Christian law. Those objectives that I just highlighted for you, they were issued under Christian law and applied then by the governments of the empires of the nations worldwide. So then historians will tell you, oh, the papal bull and the doctrine of discovery no longer exist. And I always say, like hell, those policies still exist. Those objectives still exist. How? And I said, do you know anything about the 1830 detribalization policies? And most of them I talked didn't know anything about it. Well, the 1830 detribalization policies, you will recognize the objectives. The objectives were civilization, Christianization, integration, assimilation, and liquidation. Based on what? Based on the doctrine of discovery and based on the papal bull. Now, what did they do to implement those policies? Well, the first thing they done was to terminate the sovereignty of our nations by outlawing our governments, our jurisdiction, our laws, our justice system, and our institutions. Like I said earlier, we had a democratic system of governing through our kinship clan systems and the functions of those clans. And by the way, those clans and the kinship system laws were made by who? By the grandmothers. The female side of the family made the laws governing family, home, and community. When that issue of women's lib came along, I used to get insulted by non-Indian women at a bank or wherever I was doing business, accusing me of not respecting women's lib. I said, what the hell do you mean I don't respect it? It's you that terminated it. Our women made all the laws in our home, in our family, in our communities. I said, and then your policies and your governments terminated that. Well, they terminated our sovereignty. But like I said, it was against the law for us to assemble up to 1956. So when you look at what they done then to move ahead with termination, they then focused on how to terminate individuals and families, extended families, communities, and societies of our nations. And those objectives that I just highlighted for you, you recognize them as continuing today. Now, the result of all that is that we lost total control of our political organization and our governments, our laws and our jurisdiction. We lost total control of our health, and social development, and education, losing total control of our social development. I'm talking about the social safety net we had. We had a strong social safety net. We can even show you how the rearing of children historically and today by Indian families and societies are much different from the non-Indian practice of raising children. But we had highly disciplined societies, like I was saying. So we have to go back to implementing a lot of those societies, because they were very fundamental principles that govern our societies and our kinship system and clan system. And when we look at this impact, then we lost everything to the point where we end up with third world conditions today. Dysfunctional homes, families, communities, societies, nations. We have the whole area of abuses, sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse. You name it, you could have about 3 pages of one-liners on the symptoms that we're suffering, that we have suffered as a result of these colonial policies being implemented and enforced through your laws and your governments and your churches, your religions. When we talk about that, people are asking today, Where does systemic racism come from? Well, I just showed you one of the main sources of systemic racism that's now in our institutions, in every sector, now in our laws and in our governing systems. So how did Canada then deal with colonial policies? Again, code of silence. If I was asked to ask you, how many of you know of the 1947 plan to liquidate Canada's Indian province within 25 years? Again, wherever I go, not many people know what that policy is, but that's a very major one. They started to identify how to terminate the special rights and status of Indians. And they started to look at how they could terminate the treaties that were made with us. And they started to look at how they could set up local government, municipal type government on reserves under the chiefs and councils. Now you got to keep in mind now that in the governing side and the governing structure, right after 1900, we went right to 1956 with the Indian agent in charge of the administration and management under chiefs and councils. Now that's like yesterday. So we criticize the failure of First Nations not being able to govern. How would you feel if that was to happen to your people and your society and having to deal with these negative symptoms, but losing your power of governing? So when we move on then to Canada, the 1947 plan to liquidate Canada's Indian province was 25 years. Again, I could list you a whole range of activity and events that they implemented. And that's where they got the idea of setting up boarding schools and then moved on to residential schools. And churches got in control of our education systems, contracting with the federal government. And I'm talking all religions. I went to the Prince Albert Residential School, was operated and managed by the Anglican Church. And one day I was in Ottawa as a chief of FSIN. I went back to my hotel room and my phone rang. And the Reverend Gilbert Bird of the Anglican Church was chief of Montreal Lake. He said, Saul, he says, you have to get home. The bishops of the Anglican and Catholic Church have called a meeting at the Friendship Center for us to get rid of you, he said. So I hopped the plane back then. In those days, we were lucky. Ottawa Lang was a transport minister, so we had all kinds of quick flights from Ottawa to Saskatoon. So I arrived in Saskatoon and I arrived at the Friendship Center in PA at 11 o'clock, and they were just sitting down to start. And all the bishops were sitting at the head table, and all the rest of the Indian native clergy were sitting in the back. And I threw my briefcase on the table. I said, okay, you can start now. I'm here. You want to meet about me? I said, after you're done your opening prayer, I'm going to tell all these other ones why they want to get rid of me. Why these gentlemen sitting up here want to get rid of me. And all their faces just turned red. It had to do with money. By us taking over control or shutting them down, they would lose their executive management funds that they got for each residential school that they operated. Things like that. So I didn't stay too long. I said, just want to say that you have no authority to get rid of me. So as far as I'm concerned, your meeting is over. I left. So the politics of the church didn't stop there. My mom and dad at home, we had one church at the north end, another one at the south end. both Catholic church, Anglican churches. My mom and dad used to take care of those churches. Every Sunday, my mom would cook a big meal to feed the clergy. One day I felt there was something wrong. So I went home. I was busy already shutting down or taking over these residential schools. And nothing happening at home. My mom sitting there, my dad sitting there, and nothing being cooked. So I left. I said, I'll come back next Sunday. So I went back, same thing. So I said, okay, what's going on here? My mom said to my dad, you tell him. And here, one of the clergy that used to live with my mom and dad to do his work out there went to them and told them, you're no longer welcome in the church. And my dad said, we're told we're no longer welcome in the church because of what you're doing. And he said, we talked about it. And we said, no, Saul's going to keep on doing what he's doing. We don't need the church anymore. Both my mom and dad died like that, not ever going back to the Anglican church. And about 10 years ago, our clergy, Indigenous people, said, we want your help. And that's when the residential issue came out strong. And the Indian clergy were cut off all their funding. They had no funding. So I said, well, never mind your funding and what's happening with you. You want my help? The first thing you're going to learn about is the politics of religion, the politics of church. Because as a young man, as a leader, an elder took me aside. He said, don't forget, young fellow, there's politics in everything. So they said, okay. So we had a whole half day in Prince Albert, going through the different examples of the politics of religion and the politics of church. I said, now I can help you. I can work with you. But what you want to do, you're going to be dealing with the politics of religion. So the Anglican Church of Canada was in operation with setting up an Indigenous church. So I helped them organize that. And we ordained our own bishops, and they just ordained 7 more of the clergy about a month ago. And the bishop for the Prince Albert Diocese walked into Bishop Halkett's office and said, right here in the Bible says it can't be done. So what are you going to do about it? He said, well, Bishop, sit down in that chair there. He said, I don't know what the Bible says about it. And if this is what it says, I said, we're still going to recognize our people and ordain them. And he said, and that's what Saul Sanderson is recommending. But he's also looking for 35 Indigenous bishops across Canada. That we were promised that 5 years ago, he said. And so the bishop left Bishop Halkett's office. They went ahead and ordained those people. Now he could have been sitting around asking till he was blue in the face. There'd be no agreement to get it done. But that's how I'm working with them. And the Archbishop from Canterbury is supposed to be coming to Canada and making a stopover in Prince Albert. So we're going to have a delegation to meet with him. And again, the politics of that is financing. But in the bishop's territory, Bishop Halkett's territory, 3/4 of the Anglicans are Indians and Métis. See the transition that's happening? even in the churches and religion. And I've worked with them now to introduce some of our spiritual beliefs and practices right in the Anglican Church and ministry. Nothing wrong with that. So you want to survive and you want to live together in religion and church, then there's some accommodations that have to be made. So after 1947, then, you all know what happened. 25 years took you to where? The 1960 white paper, 1969 white paper. One of the first things identified in the 69 white paper was how to finally terminate the special rights and status of Indians. How? By amending existing law or constructing new law. So I talked about our inherent rights and title. What am I talking about when I talk about inherent title? I'm talking about the sovereignty of our nations remaining intact in the title to our lands and resources. And that status remains intact to all those lands and resources that I highlighted for you that we reserved by treaty making. And when we look at that whole process, then we need to examine how the churches are going to deal with the issue of lands and resources. And the Catholic Church in particular had access to a lot of assets in that area. So I'm not a Catholic, so I can't go and see the Pope when he comes. I wouldn't mind, but I don't need to. I think people that are in that church will do something. And when we move forward, the 69 white paper set in motion this first generation devolution policy. Now, what is that? And again, code of silence. 1947 is when they started making plans on how to transfer responsibility for Indians from federal jurisdiction to provincial jurisdiction. 1969, provinces started to buy into it. And they got monies for Indians, but they didn't spend it on Indians. They spent it on themselves. And of course, I could list you a whole bunch of other types of policies and plans they had for us as Indians in 1969. And that was to emphasize the need to set up local governments. So how did they do that? Well, they tied the funding to the bands to have an incorporated entity under provincial corporate law before you could get the funding. Same thing with tribal councils. And they tried that in the FSIN and the AFN. And that's how they were looking at setting up federal municipalities on reserve lands by ban. Now, when you look at that, of course, that terminates our sovereignty remaining in the title to our lands and resources. And what happened after that? A code of silence again. How many know about the 74-76 Native policy? Well, that was to hire Indians, Métis, and Inuit in the front lines to push these policies I'm telling you about. Then came the Mulroney policy. The conservatives say, oh, we have no policies of discrimination. And what did the Mulroney government issue? The 1980 Buffalo Jump. Now, all of you remember watching a movie on the Buffalo Jump, how they herded the buffalo into the pit to kill themselves. Well, that's the theme of the 1980 Buffalo Jump. And they developed the second generation devolution policy, how to formally complete the transfer of services for Indians from federal jurisdiction to provincial jurisdiction, and how to step up the process, establishing corporate entities and services now funded federally but implemented under provincial law and jurisdiction. And on this chart that was just put up on the screen, after Trudeau announced nation to nation, a business to be implemented, I got calls from leaders and some of our own people saying, well, what do we do now? And I was anticipating the calls. So I said, well, we can continue down the path of self-termination and implementing those colonial policies that I've been warning you about. And we're still implementing them today. Or we can go down the path of self-determination, implementing our sovereignty, national powers of governing, national powers of treaty making, and implementing our jurisdictional laws in every sector over internal, external, and international affairs. Now, the self-government chart you're looking at is what exists today. But again, it's much in the form of a code of silence, because nobody ever bothered to understand the impact of patriating the Canadian Constitution in 1982 and how it was done. Well, like I said, I was there and dealing with that patriation. And you look at that nation to nation, government to government, sovereignty treaty relations process. This chart you're looking at, the framework is a comprehensive legal political framework governing Crown sovereignty relations. It governs nation to nation relations, government to government relations. And it provides for implementing inherent rights treaties and treaty rights in every sector. Now you go down the middle of that chart, you hear people talking about relationships. And I want to come back to that because I want to identify for you and with you what governs this sovereignty treaty framework. Well, first of all, it's the inherent rights, inherent sovereignty of our nations, and the Crown's assumed sovereignty. And some people accuse me of coining that term. No, it's not something I coined. It's the Supreme Court that created that term, Crown sovereignty of Canada. So there's two sovereigns, pretty clearly identified. So what governs that framework? Well, it's the inherent rights and title I highlighted for you. It's the international treaties, treaty rights that I highlighted for you. It's the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now, Judge Dixon said to me, never let them leave that out of the Constitution. So it's in the Constitution, section 25(2 applies the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And he says, here's why. I've never had a chance to discuss this issue with anybody, and you're one of the first ones I've had a chance to talk to about my understanding of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Those are royal instructions from the Crown and the British Parliament to our governments here in Canada and our people here in Canada. And it's in the form of what I call a Bill of Rights that we have, recognizing your inherent sovereignty, your national powers of governing, your national powers of treaty making, the treaty making process between the Crown and Indian nations. It recognizes all those inherent rights you have there on your chart, plus others. But it also recognizes your inherent title to lands and resources, with your sovereignty remaining intact in the title to those lands and resources. Now, how many of you gone to school to learn about the Royal Proclamation, 1763? I bet you never had that interpretation provided to you. So I call it now the Crown's Bill of Rights under the Royal Proclamation of 1763. But that's another instrument that governs that framework. So now you come to the Constitution Act of 1982. And I gave you an example of what's recognized by Section 35. Going over to London, England, I felt I was going there with about 270 to 300 errors in my back. Why? Because the term was coined about Section 35 being an empty box. And that's all I heard. Section 35 is an empty box. Section 35 is an empty box. And I would say, no, it's a damn full box. Well, now you can see with all the inherent rights identified for you, and now what the Royal Proclamation provides for in terms of recognition. Those are just two reasons why Section 35 is a full box, because now we have the treaties. So then Section 35 is a major provision in the treaty, in the Constitution of Canada. It was never there before, but it recognizes everything that we've been after for recognition. So when we look at the ongoing instruments that recognize, that governs this sovereignty treaty framework between the Crown and Indian nations, the UN conventions still apply. There's the Rights of the Child Convention. There's the Political Convention that recognizes the sovereignty of nations. And I could go on with you, those conventions that are there, but they apply to this framework. But now we have the Bill C-15 that applies the UN Declaration. And I said back then, you're missing out the Organization of American States Declaration, but we can still use it. So that's what governs the framework, the comprehensive legal framework between the Crown and Indian nations. And you go down the middle of the chart, it provides for political relations in what form? Equality of government, jurisdiction, law, and courts. And I gave you examples. It provides for treaty relations. And I've given you examples of how we need to implement our treaties and inherent rights under our respective government's jurisdiction laws with unique and special laws. And how the treaties are international treaties. And that creates a whole new relationship. And that's why the Supreme Court declared Canada's assumed sovereignty, because those treaties are international. Now, judicial relations is also provided in this framework. Well, where's our justice system? I keep telling our leaders, why are you complaining about the non-Indian laws and justice system when you know full well it's based on their colonial policies that most Canadians don't even know about? But I said, we need our own justice system that's both traditional and contemporary. And we need to implement our own jurisdiction under our own inherent legal system. So then you talk about the interface of government jurisdiction law, the Quebec Civil Code in Quebec, French law, the English common law system in Canada, English law. Well, we now have to implement the inherent legal system of the governments of Indian nations. So that's where the play comes on the interface of government jurisdictional law. And we could go into a lot of detail on that, but not tonight. Then comes the economic relations. And you don't have a chart on the economy. Can you take a picture of that or not? If you can't, it's okay. What we have is a need to implement our own economy, and I developed a comprehensive chart on how we would implement inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector of the economy. But not just that, we'd identify how we implement our ownership and equity in every sector of the economy under our own Trade and Commerce Act. Paul Martin says, does that include commerce? I said, you're damn right it does. That's where you spent all your time shutting us out in terms of economics and an economy. We will have an economy under our jurisdiction laws. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of having to legislate in every sector with unique and special laws. Then comes the fiscal relations area. Well, I already told you that from 1900s to 1956, the Indian agent was in charge of our administration and management. I could never see an Indian agent doing a budget. So the fiscal relations area needs to have the capacity recognized in terms of our jurisdiction. Again, when I was chief at home in 72, one of the first things I done was develop the Finance Administration Act. And I developed a government-to-government fiscal agreements between the feds under their Finance Administration Act and our Finance Administration Act. And I based it on our budgeting, not on the contributions they give us. That's not a budget. So we still need a comprehensive budget that we can put together for the financing of our governments. But when I developed that government-to-government fiscal agreement, regional officials came out, they said, we can't sign this. I said, bring your lawyer next week. So they did. And he was sitting across from me in the meeting. He said, hey, chief, he says, why did you want me here? They didn't even tell him why he was coming. But anyway, I said, I developed this government-to-government fiscal agreement and I identified how. He said, let me see it. In 20 minutes, he opened it to the back page and he told the regional official, sign it. But here today, we're still dealing with contribution agreements. And all that is running programs and services for the federal government. And the devolution process is designed to take over from the federal government. Well, as you can see in this structure, the federal government has to maintain all their responsibilities in every sector, recognizing inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector under their legal, fiscal, jurisdictional trust obligations. So the fiscal relations and financing, then we have to move forward ourselves to develop our comprehensive budgets, the detailed budgeting in every sector that we want to implement. Then comes, of course, the international relations. And I gave you an example of how we can implement the UN Declaration. So what I've given you here tonight is 500 years of colonial policies in about 20 minutes. And I'm going to stop there for now. And being an old politician, I think I used up my time, eh? So there's no questions? No, just kidding. Well, I'd like to hear from some of your people on what you think about the presentation. But also don't be afraid to ask questions. Doug Cardinal, you know Doug Cardinal, the architect that designed the Museum of Man. He's an Indian Métis from Alberta, an architect. I was over to Venice with him. And I was doing a presentation. When I was done, he said, "So you can't die," he told me. So I've given you a lot of info in a short while. Or did everybody go to sleep on me? I hope not.
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm just awash in all the information, and I don't think I got nearly all of it, but I certainly learned a lot. And my question to you is, what can I, as a common non-Aboriginal Anglican do now that will make a difference? All this stuff is appalling, and the perpetuation of it is as appalling as the original stuff. But so I'm saddened by that, but I don't know what to do. Is there something that the common person can do to bring influence and perspective that is certainly more honoring of our Creator and the reconciliation that we so desperately need?
I think one of the first things you could look at is what will the Anglican Church do collectively? And that's the how. How would you make the changes and influence the changes individually, in your family, your community, like you're asking? And that's only fair. Now, keep in mind what I gave to you. One of the elders told me when I was about 18 years old, he said, "Boy, come here." He grabbed me by the shoulder. And he said, "I want to tell you something. I want to tell you once," he said, "but you remember it for the rest of your life." He said, 100 years of political change is like 1 year in your lifetime. Now, I've been in the business for 65 years. I don't know if I'll make 100 years, but I'll try. But you see how long political change takes? But you can set the stage by identifying where you want to start. And even if you looked at how you recognize and respect our inherent rights, but it's not taught, it's not recognized. And it's critical, especially in religion and church, that's who we are. That's the foundation of who we are. And that's why it's so different between the non-Indians and Indian communities and the needs. Now, just like I said earlier, the spiritual element for us and component is in every sector. To give you an example, your concern as an individual, like I am and others, what do we do about the lands and resources that are Mother Earth being destroyed? Our beliefs, ma'am, is that we have connections to all living things. And we believe everything has a spirit of life. The plants, the birds, the fish, the water, everything. And what is that connection? That connection we have with Mother Earth and nature is one of sovereignty, spiritual, and cultural connections. And if you could understand and see what our prayers are like and songs are like, they honor and respect the life forms of everything. And when they're opening their prayers, they say, "Now, all my relations." They're not talking about my uncle, my aunt, and grandma, and so on. They're talking about the life that's out there that we don't recognize and respect. And you see, if we're going to deal with laws on the environment, laws on the climate change, laws on just the use and occupation of our lands and waters and all the elements that are out there. For every tree we damage, we're damaging what the tree takes after we breathe it out. Whatever the tree produces, we breathe in. So it's pretty fundamental in terms of the spiritual practices and beliefs. Now, that's very critical. And I used to go to your church and on the reserve, like I said, my mom and dad were staunch Anglicans. So we had to get up and do the chores and then go to church. And Bishop from there we're setting up the casinos here in Saskatchewan. And I headed up the team on setting up those casinos. So he said, the gaming. And he said, "Saul, the people in Saskatoon don't want to support the casino in Saskatoon. He said, will you come and talk to my people in the church? I said, oh yeah, Bishop, I can go tell them how I used to gamble at the church on my reserve. I used to take pies and cakes and a few nickels and dimes in my pocket. I said, I'd go to the bingo and take some home. But I also had extra change to go home with. But you took it away on me on Sunday. And I said, yeah, you still want me to go to talk to your people about gaming and casinos? Oh, no. He said, I'll do it myself. And that's some of the things that are pretty fundamental to us as a people. And that spiritual practice and beliefs is very critical. Like even naming, you get the Christian names. Well, we had a whole tradition. It still carries on today. We get our spiritual names. And there's meaning behind those spiritual names. And the belief is that your spiritual name connects you to the Creator. Those types of things, those types of practices and beliefs are coming out more and more now for the non-Indian to understand. So I don't know if I helped you, ma'am, but just start from wherever you want and do what you can.
Brian, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Don, and thank you, Senator Sanderson, for your presentation. A lot to take in, a lot of information. I assume that we'll get access to the documents you put on the screen there at some point, Don. Like the second one, I was having trouble seeing, and also be good if we could have access to the recordings as well, if you want to. So that's good. Okay, I did have one question for you, Senator Sanderson. You taught us a lot about inherent rights, and you had them broken down in different categories and the list of them. But you also mentioned that, along with those inherent rights are associated duties and responsibilities. Could you maybe give us some examples of what those duties and responsibilities are? Well,
I just gave you one, in terms of our connection to Mother Earth.
Right.
And there's duties, sacred duties and responsibilities associated with that connection. And there's ways of teaching that. But like I said, we have songs and ceremony on how to implement and take responsibility for that sacred responsibility to how we treat Mother Earth. And for everything that we take from Mother Earth, we give back in some form. And that's usually using tobacco and honoring the life that you're taking from Mother Earth to use for yourself. Now for the children, a lot of what we're talking about are beliefs and values built right into our languages. Any nation's language does that. So that whole process of knowing our language and beliefs and practices, using our language, we lost it in my family and my community. The Anglican Church took over. And I laughed because I'm going to tell you, when I sat in church listening to the minister up there preaching away, and I got to tell you, I felt that his God that he was preaching for was a very mean one. Because everything he preached was so negative about the role of God in your life. And I don't think we need to have that continue these days, because spiritual practice and beliefs are supposed to be justice, fair and honest. The integrity has to be there, even between the churches, even between religions. And I see that happening too. Yes. I used to go to residential school, and my cousins were there in the Catholic residential school for a track meet. I'd run up to them and go talk to them, and they'd run away from me. At lunchtime, I'd go sit beside them. They'd take their plates and run away from me. I didn't know it was a sin to talk to an Anglican. The Catholics wouldn't talk to Anglicans because it was a sin. No, we don't need that. We don't need that kind of stuff. So teaching the children our language. And I know when I go to teach the young people about the inherent rights I just walked you through, you know what they say? Why haven't we told this ever? That's who I am. And now I see a light at the end of the tunnel. So just teaching them what each of those inherent rights are all about. They sure live a different life after that, knowing who they really are. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that helps. Thank you.
Okay.
Does anybody else have a question?
I do. It's Wilma. Not so much as a question as a statement. I think what we got tonight could be a whole course, actually. Interesting. I'm pretty sure I missed a lot of it because I get lost in thought and contemplating. So I've done a fair amount of self-education, and my brother-in-law and family educate me a fair amount, but I'm always open to history and reading. Some of the things you were talking about, like, I mean, with your own life and that, is there's so much history there. Is there somewhere we can go to for resourcing? And I have another question. I can't believe I've never asked this question before. And because I've been a part of giving tobacco, where did that come from? Giving tobacco?
The tobacco, well, as you know, we grow the original tobacco, and we still have that tobacco that's used for our ceremonies and sacred processes. And that's how we got to learn to use it. But it's a form of giving. When you are respecting what you're taking from the life forms of Mother Earth and using it. Then even after you take it and use it, there's a whole protocol of how you mix it and use it for yourself, for healing or for prevention. And that's just a major part of spiritual beliefs and practices we have. But you see, most people don't believe that medicine has a spirit. So the non-Indian medicines don't really work as good as ours. No.
My brother-in-law, when I asked those questions, if he doesn't want to answer me, he just says it's tradition. And that means.
Yeah, it's very sacred. Very sacred. And what was your first question?
Resourcing, something
Oh,
to
yeah.
read or look at or watch.
Yeah, what we done at home in 72, you see, a lot of the documentation and information we needed didn't exist anywhere. So we had to develop it.
Right.
And I'm still doing that, developing these documents and charts. But when we look at the in-school program today, there's lots of schools on reserves now, teaching our own people. You know that they're not even teaching what I showed you today. Why is that? You see how colonial we are?
Yeah.
So then we have the First Nations University of Canada, and we've graduated over 5,000 students now. And they leave there without knowing anything about the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, one of our major governing structures and organizations. We don't teach it. So we got problems on our side that we need to fix. So I'm working on First Nations University of Canada. Let me give you an example of what problems we have. We have the convention of the Federation of Nations. What is that? That's a political agreement between all the bands, the 74 bands of the nations that form the Federation of Nations. They're ratified right in the communities through their membership, not just by chief and council. And to implement that political agreement and that structure of the Federation of Nations, we have the Convention Act of the Federation of Nations. Now that's under our own inherent legal system, applying our own jurisdiction. And that Convention Act then governs all the governing bodies of the Federation of Nations. The lawful assembly now, the lawful political assembly, is formally recognized for implementation under the Convention Act of the FSIN Convention and our sovereignty. So then we have the Executive Council, the Government Commission, the Justice Commission, and so on. And they're all governed by that Convention Act. They have their own acts, yes, but that's the structure of the governing system of the Federation of Nations. So we have the First Nations University of Canada Act that provides for the charter of our own university. And after all these years, we still haven't implemented our university system because people are failing to recognize our jurisdiction and our inherent legal system that establishes our university, you see? And the federal government now can also issue a charter for our university. Like across Canada, all the universities, as you know, are certified by the provinces, except for 5 that have a federal charter too. And they basically control the organization of colleges and universities. But I investigated the history of universities. Where did it start? Well, the first university was started by a papal bull, going back to the power of that pope. 1696, he issued the first papal bulls certifying a university. From there, they went all over Europe, certifying universities through papal bulls. England, some in the US. That's how powerful that church was. And that's how they started their university system worldwide. And the other option was some leaders in some states got together and combined all their in-school systems and high school systems to make a university. There's different methods that were used to create and implement universities. So what I'm saying is, surely they can recognize our university under our own government jurisdictional law. Like I'm talking, you see? And that system has been there for implementation for 20 years. So I'm going to be implementing it, and you can be sure that there'll be a whole division identifying how we teach our own history and our own issues like inherent rights treaties and our own special training for government specialists, treaty specialists, and so on. And when I've done, I headed up the Medicine Chest Task Force for 2.5 years in Treaty 6. And I met with international Indigenous leaders in health. First thing they said to me in Ottawa, they said, we don't have a home. We're all individuals that heading up these organizations, and our organizations don't have a home international. Can you set up a Indigenous College of Science and Health in the First Nations University of Canada? And we can do that. And they said, the reason we're asking you to do that is because your people in your communities have more knowledge and information about our own health system than anywhere else. And we need to support you, they said. So that's one of the institutions we'll be looking at implementing and developing. Whether people liked it or not, I headed up the first casino development in Saskatchewan, White Bear, Saskatchewan. And I ran into trouble because the feds passed legislation under the criminal code recognizing provincial jurisdiction for gaming. but within their own boundaries. But what they forgot is that provinces don't have any jurisdiction on reserves and by ban. So I went ahead and set up our own casino. And under that law, they had a law that the provinces control all electronic gaming. So all the slot machines were electronic. So the province had jurisdiction for that. So what I did is we developed a White Bear Trade and Commerce Act, and we entered into a trade agreement with one of the tribes across the border to import the slot machines. And Custom Canada approved it. We got to the border with the semi-load of slot machines. RCMP were there to stop us, and they said no. They got all their own laws and jurisdiction, and their trade agreement is right here. They're going through with their slot machines. See how many times we take shortcuts, but that issue was resolved back then. But they still charge us after. But if I was there, I can tell you, being a former policeman, they'd have been securing the place, never mind raiding it.
Okay, Alex, our time is up, so I'll turn it back to you to close.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, everybody, for staying on and listening to this very informative session. And it's nice to get the fulsome information from our senator and our elder from one of our communities and a long-time leader as well. So where do we go from here? Margie asked, what can I do? The purpose of this session, from my perspective, is to garner some knowledge on people, to get as much information on Indigenous people and the plight that we have in our struggles, in our communities, and our governance structures, and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't at all suggesting that we correct those mistakes immediately, but the awareness of these, I think, is important. Being aware of what happened and sharing that information to your friends and colleagues from time to time, I think that's a benefit of this presentation. Certainly, there's many years of corrections, corrective actions, and positive stuff that needs to be done. Certainly not wanting people to resolve our issues overnight, but just by listening and being here, I think you've taken a big leap on carrying the message and doing your things, that the small things that Saul suggested that we could do our part in living in a positive and just environment. So I want to really thank you for holding on. I see we didn't lose very many people, and that's a good sign. I would like to hear some comments if you have any comments to provide. But as I said when I started off the session here, this is first of a series of informational sessions that I will be promoting through Immanuel Indigenous Ministry over the next year. And certainly some of the presentations today, there's going to be some spin-offs from there. And you're correct, this could be a course in itself and take a year-long, couple of years to know exactly all the details that the Senator has talked about tonight. So thank you very much, Saul Sanderson, for taking the time with us tonight and giving us your perspective and your experience, life experience, right from the age 15 at 65 years. My goodness, that's a lot of energy, a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge that you're expressing in a matter of an hour and a half, I would say. So thank you very much. And again, not to be repetitive, but it needs to be repeated. Thank you for everybody for participating. I wish to express my thanks to Dawn and Diane for helping me with with the process of getting people registered and manning the being a technician here. Thank you very much. With that, I don't have anything else to say, but to encourage you to provide some commentary, written or otherwise, or verbal to me when you see me at church there, or see me anywhere. Thank you for those people that participated that weren't part of the church. Thank you for doing that. That's it. Time equity. See you all soon. Bye. Thank you. So, get
Yeah,
some rest.
thank you.